Chapter 20. No sooner had Gregory's ship left the harbor and he returned to his room than he sat down on his bed and began to write Vivian a letter. "How did it all break like this?" he wrote. "How is it that, so much love later, I was able to offer you nothing but heartache? Please forgive me, oh please forgive me, my love. I waited and waited, watched the dock until I couldn't see it any more, but you never came. In the end, is it that what we had did not mean that much? Or was the pain I caused you too great to overcome? In which direction should the apologies now flow, I wonder? Probably in both directions, but I can only do my part of that. So please forgive me, and know that I forgive you also. There is a kind of relief in endings, isn't there? Please tell me that there is, because right now I cannot seem to feel anything but the burning agony of abandonment." He wrote on until his love gave way to his inner hurt, and then he switched over to his journal, where he let the toxic tide of regret, rejection, and betrayal sweep out onto the page in sharply shaped letters and splashes of ink. "You said you will miss my visits to you and your mother," he wrote. "After everything, this is what you will miss. That is like saying that you will miss being my neighbor or will miss selling me bookbinding glue. Is that all this was to you then?" Then, after hurling his journal across the room and curling himself up into a miserable ball and closing his eyes for a while, he retrieved his journal and returned to his letter. "What is the kindest, sweetest, least painful thing that I can write her right now?" he thought. He finished up the letter in the tone that he thought befitted the angel that he knew she wanted to believe in. Then he reread what he had written, wondered if it was a lie, or if he could ever actually be that holy one day, and then proceeded to loathe himself over the gaping disparity between who he was in his journal and this unattainable level of perfection that he had put in the letter. Well, it could not be helped. He had to send her something. So he folded up the paper, found an envelope, and then reached into his pocket to pull out his pocket notebook so that he could write down her address. And that was when he discovered, with extreme horror, that he did not have his notebook. In an instant, he forgot his earlier overwhelming feelings of personal inadequacy and got to work feverishly turning the contents of his stateroom upside down. He went through every pocket of every article of clothing that he had brought with him. Desperate, he looked into drawers and under furniture that he had not even touched yet. He had feared misplacing her address, he now remembered, and so he had written out a second copy of it to put in his suitcase. Drowning in panic, he now went to work on the compartments of his luggage, but there was nothing. Kneeling on the floor over his empty suitcase, he closed his eyes and tried to recall what had happened in those last frantic hours before boarding the ship. It had been a pandemonium of emotional convulsions, frenzied packing, locking up his bedroom, and last-minute preparations with his cleaning lady. And then he saw it, the image that he had been searching for in his mind. There he was, sitting in his study and writing out the second copy of her address so that he could put it in his luggage, and then the cleaning lady knocked on his door, and he had stood up and left everything right where it was. Open notebook, open inkwell, freshly copied address on the loose sheet of paper beside them. In trying to prevent it, he had brought about the very thing he had feared. In his mind's eye, he tried to see the address on the loose sheet of paper. There were the hazy gray scribbles of the letters. What was her address? He could remember none of it. Maybe there was a 7 in it. Her street name began with a vowel. He could see her street and her front door clearly in his mind, had been there 100 times. But the harder he tried to recall the specific information of her address, the more blank the sheet in his memory became, until at last he threw the nearest item across the room in sheer frustration. It was a pair of shoes, and it hit the door with greater force than he had imagined, since the stateroom was smaller than he had realized. The sound sharply brought him back to his present circumstances. I am on a ship, sailing away, minute by minute, from the one my heart loves, he thought. She probably no longer believes that I love her, and she tells me that this love is a dead end anyways, so it hardly matters. But she will wait for me to write, to apologize, to say something, and I have no way to reach her. I tried, beloved, I tried. No area in which I failed you was ever entirely my fault. And here I am failing you again, and it is beyond my control to do anything about it. It does not matter what I do. Fate has apparently determined to crush me. He went back to the bed and sat down on it. Perhaps sleep was the answer, but he never slept more than a couple of hours, so that would be a very temporary solution at best. He looked at his watch. It was not even noon. Would someone serve him a drink this early in the day on this pathetic barge? In the end, he settled for lying in bed and staring at the ceiling for a few hours. You ought to know what I'm good at, love. Lying absolutely motionless for long periods at a stretch. Rather useless in your world, isn't it? The image of her sitting beside him in the darkened theater and listening to opera rose up before him. Ah, her loveliness, how she opened herself up to this new experience, hesitant but trusting, like a young girl letting herself be led by an older lover. And then he remembered how she had told him that this had all been his world, that she would not have chosen these things, and he suddenly seemed to himself like an aged lover trying to ignite the flagging interest of a younger woman, eager more for dancing and boisterous youthful entertainments than for evenings of reading French plays and of listening to people singing in German on stage for hours at a stretch. But she was there because of you. She told you that, his heart whispered. Oh, go away, unreasonable heart, he thought. What good did it ever do me to listen to you? As the afternoon wore on and turned into late afternoon, he ventured out of his room and went in search of the bar, and once he found it, he sat down and proceeded to get himself nicely drunk. Then he staggered back to his room, fell on his bed fully dressed, and let the movement of the ship on the ocean do the rest of the work. When he woke up, he wrote. Then he showered and shaved. Then he went back to the bar. And so it went for the next 3 days, until one day a sharp knock came on the door and would not stop until Gregory opened it. It was Wolf. Gregor, I have been pounding on your door for the last 3 days, he said, exasperated. I hear you occasionally breathing in there, so I know you haven't leapt overboard, but why won't you answer me? Gregory stepped back and let Wolf in before shutting the door again. I didn't hear you, he replied truthfully. I haven't been, paying attention much, I suppose. You've been drunk out of your skull, you mean, replied Wolf. It smells like a distillery in here, and it looks like you are shivering. You're fading away before my eyes. What happened before we left that put you into this state? I did notice that Fräulein Vivian did not come to see you off at the dock. You are not going to spend the rest of this voyage holding that against her, will you? She is a child. She is hurt and offended, and it is understandable. Pull yourself together, man. I was supposed to write to her, Gregory said brokenly, looking out of the small porthole at the never-ending scene of dark ocean. But I do not have my notebook or her address. She will not hear from me and will imagine that I have gone off forever." "Ach, das ist nicht gut. You could not have taken greater care with her address when you were packing your luggage?" asked Wolf with a deep frown. "As a matter of fact, it was while I was taking the greater care that this happened," said Gregory, and he explained how he had been copying out the address and then left both the sheet and the notebook behind. Wolf sat down in one of the 2 armchairs in the small room. He sighed. "I'm sorry, Gregor, but you are what is commonly known as a hopeless mess. I will see if I can get word to Ferdinand Anderson, and perhaps he can help. He is in Florida now, but could perhaps go back through New Orleans on his way back to Texas. I'm very pleased with him of late. He was rather useless in the past, but now he has taken up a useful profession, namely mapping the continent from the air. Did you know about that? I confess, I cannot entirely understand how someone would stuff themselves into a flying can and be tossed about in the air, but I can see how maps might be improved in this way. You met Ferdinand, remember?" Gregory shook his head. After several days of abject despair combined with drinking, his memory was at its worst, and the loss of his notebook further amplified the impression of his own stupidity. He was not even entirely certain of their upcoming travel itinerary. Where was this ship going to dock again? Oh yes, somewhere in Normandy? "Well, never mind," said Wolf. "It is not important. Here is what is important." Wolf stood up and came to stand across from Gregory, pulling Gregory's gaze reluctantly away from the window. "Listen to me now. Not everything in the world is your fault. Some things happen the way they do because of forces outside of you, forces greater than you, and who knows, perhaps even forces wiser than you. If you are meant to connect with her during this voyage, then a way will present itself. If not, then you are not meant to write to her, and you will have to resign yourself to that. You came on this trip to help me, and you cannot be of much help if you are going to spend the entire time inebriated and a burden to me. Pull yourself together, go dress, and we will have dinner, such as it is, in my room. At the rate you are going, your fingers will turn visibly blue in another day or 2, and after that, even visits to the bar will become difficult. Have some sense of self-preservation at least." He reached out his hands, turned Gregory around, and pushed him gently in the direction of the toilet and small shower. The water poured over Gregory like a kindness straight from heaven, and it was extremely disappointing that the shower was only going to last a single minute. Gregory reached for the towel, stepped out cautiously in case Wolf was still about, but Wolf had let himself out and left. On his bed, Wolf had laid out a fresh set of clothing for Gregory, every item carefully smoothed out, and even the shoe brush thoughtfully laid out next to Gregory's shoes, which had not been brushed or polished in some time, he now noticed. Ah, Wolf. He may as well have left a handwritten note stating, "Dress with dignity, and for God's sake clean your shoes before stepping into my room." Wolf's room was not large either, but it was larger, and had a sofa and coffee table, where Gregory's did not. And on the table there was a giant glass bowl filled with fresh, flesh-colored orchids. "You are drinking water, I see," said Wolf, eyeing with suspicion the glass that Gregory came in with. "Water is for plants. Are you not feeling well?" "The liquor does require some assistance to digest," admitted Gregory. "And this is not a sign to you that you should not ingest it?" asked Wolf. "Ach, why waste my breath? It is hopeless." "Here, put down that glass and take this one," he said, handing Gregory a crystal goblet that, to anyone else, would have looked like it was filled with red wine. Few and sacred were the opportunities when Wolf consumed anything in Gregory's presence. It was an intimacy, and also an embarrassment, that the constraints of travel had put upon them. Gregory sat down on the sofa, and Wolf sat down in the armchair, and they drank in silence. The strangeness of drinking cold, a beverage that Gregory usually drank warm, was a jarring observation. What a magical transformation this beverage makes in us, mused Gregory, not for the first time. What would we be without it? He shuddered at the mere thought. They were not imbibing enough to create a real glow, but a sparkle came upon them nonetheless, and Gregory could see the heightened handsomeness of the older man's features and the lively gleam that came into his eyes as they drank. The ship's movements made the line of water in the orchid vase move, and for many silent minutes this motion held Gregory's attention. "Why do we keep going on?" asked Gregory after a while, after Wolf had refilled their glasses. "Each one of us must find his own reason. I found mine at the intersection of history, books, learning, and curiosity. Dieter is convinced that he can find a cure for tuberculosis. It is the same question for all creatures, wouldn't you think?" said Wolf, smiling at Gregory. "I don't know. A few short decades, a wife and children, a job that brings in just enough to get everybody by. That probably brings enough of its own small reasons to keep a person in the game," mused Gregory. "Oh, don't make me laugh," said Wolf cynically. "That kind of life would never have satisfied you, not even before, when it would have been a possibility. Be honest with yourself, Gregor. Often, chronically dissatisfied spirits such as yourself are drawn to the possibility of adventure and new vistas. Well, now you have the chance to have some adventure. We are about to disembark on a continent that has greatly changed since you saw it last." "I should hope so," grumbled Gregory. "The last time I was here I saw the vistas from a hole in a trench, with the shouts of the dying around me loud in my ears." "So this time around, enjoy that it can also be pleasant. I think this change of scenery at this time may actually be the best thing for you. Stop despairing. Everything will work out as it should. Have some faith. And now, let us toast to a successful voyage. You are doing a great service to the cultural, printed legacy of Europe by helping me," said Wolf importantly. Gregory nodded, clinked glasses with Wolf, an extremely uncomfortable gesture under the circumstances, and he searched the innermost corners of his heart for a tiny part of himself that could care about the cultural legacy of Europe's books. But his heart was full only of Vivian and her absence. To a quick and efficient trip, he thought. Vivian, don't hurt too much over not hearing from me. I'm coming back to you, as quick as I can, and we will work something out. There is some way out of all of this hurt, I know there is. I just cannot see it right now. But there must be another way. Forget the post office. In this moment, I'm closing my eyes and sending you my entire heart." Wolf did not go to Europe to stay in economized lodging. In Vienna, their car took them straight from the train station to the Hotel Imperial. Wolf chatted in German with the driver, excited to be back in his hometown. Gregory propped his arm up on the inside of the door and held his head up with it. Would there be a message from Ferdinand waiting for them? He worried despondently. They reached the hotel. The porter loaded up their items, and Wolf irritatingly chatted for a while with the front desk attendant before inquiring about any messages. Yes, there was a message, but unfortunately it just said that Ferdinand had tried the New Orleans telephone switchboard, and of course the Prevets had no telephone. Gregory sighed and had to restrain himself to keep from kicking the registration desk. Wolf told him to keep his spirits up. Ferdinand would try again and send word to Innsbruck with any new information, and then they went up to their rooms to get ready for an evening out on the town. Gregory was surprised, when he came back down to the lobby in his formal evening wear, to find Anastasia coming out of a nearby lounge. She looked fantastic, shimmery and refined, an image that held without the illusion ripping, until she spoke. "Gregor, you look dreadful," she said, with her characteristic absence of sweetness, and in her sultry, low and foreign tones. "It is a pleasure to see you as well," he told her, dutifully collecting her pale fingers in his hand and bowing over them. He had managed to forget that this trip would involve Anastasia, and he'd been most disappointed when Wolf had reminded him of it. To have to deal with this reptile on top of everything else was the last straw on top of his pile of troubles. "Wolf told me that you look like a balloon with half its air let out these days. I see he was in earnest. Well, perhaps I can cheer you up," she said with a stunning smile. "I rather doubt it," said Gregory. "Say, you don't happen to have some of that parliamentary vodka about you, do you?" "No, not today. But I hear the local bars have excellent Hungarian apricot brandy," replied Anastasia. "Could you help me into my wrap?" she asked with faux innocence, and then turned slowly, so that he could admire her fantastic figure from behind. It took him almost a solid minute to locate her fur-lined cape draped across a nearby sofa. Good grief, only Anastasia would wear fur in summer. She never turned around to assist him. Gregory wondered vaguely at which point etiquette would sanction the stabbing of a lady in her bare back. "Oh, wonderful, my children. I see you are already prepared to go," said Wolf as he arrived in the lobby. "How charming to have us all back together. And now, off to the Staatsoper." The opera that night was Othello. An ill-fated love, jealousy, a murder, and a grand finale suicide. In his present state, it was almost more than Gregory could bear. He wished he could vomit his emotional insides out. Wolf, on his return to his hometown, meanwhile, was like an over-enthusiastic tourist, eager to see every sight and read every guidebook and brochure. They spent the next couple of days touring the key attractions of the city of Vienna, from the Hofburg to Schönbrunn. "Oh, this was not here when I was here last," Wolf kept exclaiming, or, "This was not here when I lived here," he would say. Cynically, Gregory pointed to the Stephansdom Cathedral. "And what about that?" he asked. "Was that here when you lived here?" "Don't be facetious, young man," replied Wolf. "That thing was built in the 14th century. "Are we going in, then?" asked Gregory blandly. "Don't be facetious," repeated Wolf. They stopped in a souvenir shop where, in a brief glimmer of hope, Gregory bought a couple of postcards, an Edelweiss print scarf, and a picture guidebook of the city of Vienna. He tried to picture himself bringing these gifts to Vivian upon his return, and her smiling and being happy to have them. Solid evidence of his thinking of her while he had been away. He tried to imagine bringing her back to Vienna with him one day and going to visit all of the places that they were seeing now, and she would be wide-eyed and appreciative, and it would be a marvelous visit. Then he remembered that they had parted bitterly and that she was unlikely to even have a coffee with him again at the Café du Monde, much less take an overseas voyage with him, and his dreadful mood returned in full force. After the first day, even Anastasia kept her distance, noticing he was largely ignoring her anyways. Gregory's German had never been very good, but now his memory was like Swiss cheese, and he found himself forgetting entire phrases, sometimes even in English. This forced him to stick close to the others, although his mood would have preferred solitude, and he even found himself inadvertently riding the giant Viennese Ferris wheel with Anastasia after she mentioned apricot brandy again, and then said what he hoped were the words Riedler Bar, but were actually the word Riesenrad. The part of Vienna that best suited Gregory's mood on this trip was their afternoon stroll through the Zentralfriedhof cemetery, where Wolf wished to stop in and pay his respects at several graves. It was not at all like the cemeteries filled with above-ground graves that were necessary in historic New Orleans. This was a cemetery that was beautiful, grassy, park-like, and filled with large old trees. A perfection of sadness, refined over the years, hung over the place. Gregory felt his soul sigh, and he wondered if he could just stay there forever and haunt the place like a disoriented but vaguely contented ghost. The plan was to go to Innsbruck first, to save Wolf's books, then to cross over the border into Switzerland, where Wolf had made arrangements with his bank in Bern, and finally to meet up with Dieter in Munich in preparation for the return voyage. Certain of their travel supplies had to be procured freshly and very carefully, a logistical challenge that Gregory was happy to leave in Wolf's care. A colleague of Anastasia's, a man named Bedřich, joined up with them, and they made the finishing touches on arrangements for the transfer of the books. But Bedřich was a middle-aged man who truly was as old as he looked, so when they went out in the evening, he went to bed early, and then took an earlier train out so as to be ahead of them, and to be able to put the next stage of the plan into motion. Gregory, Anastasia, and Wolf went down to the train station the following day. There, Gregory leaned absent-mindedly against a pillar, while Anastasia bought a newspaper, and Wolf bought their tickets to Innsbruck. Gregory looked at the natives in their ridiculous Alpine-styled hats with feathers decorating the brims, and he thought for the 100th time that no self-respecting Frenchman, or even American Southern gentleman, could be induced to wear the like in public. He was leaning in this way and thinking about hat styles when a disturbance broke out further down the train station hall. The police had encircled an older man and were attempting to lead him away, but he was resisting arrest. Gregory was standing far away, but could make out that the man was not Wolf, so therefore his involvement was not needed. It was unpleasant, though, to hear the man's cries being drowned out by the policeman's loud demands that he stop resisting and go with them immediately to the police station. Anastasia, looking businesslike and smartly dressed in a pencil skirt, dark heels, and a dark blue travel suit jacket, whose belt tied trimly around her slim waist, returned with her newspaper. "Ah, another one," she said, turning in the direction of the scuffle and wrinkling up her nose. "This is so terrible. It is becoming increasingly unpleasant here." Wolf appeared with their tickets. "Why is that man resisting arrest?" asked Gregory. "Probably because he has done nothing wrong," said Wolf, his face set into a deep frown. "Then why are they arresting him?" asked Gregory. "I cannot make out exactly what they are saying. My German is a little rusty." "Probably because he is Jewish," said Wolf, "and things are going to get worse for the Jews, I fear, before they get any better." "How so?" asked Gregory. "Oh, Gregor, do you not read the papers, ever?" asked Anastasia sarcastically, and she threw the folded newspaper hard at Gregory so that he had to work fast to be able to catch it. Their train arrived, and they went in and found an empty compartment, in which Anastasia immediately occupied an entire side with herself, her hat box, her handbag, her hat, her scarf, and so forth. The compartment appeared full, and the porter had not yet even loaded any of their large luggage items. Once they had brought on all the luggage, Anastasia pulled all the curtains shut. "Put your head in your hat box, Anastasia," grumbled Wolf, "but I shall look at the Austrian countryside." And he pulled the curtains open again on the exterior window. It was hot and uncomfortable in the compartment. Gregory propped himself up against the curtains, blocking the view into the train corridor, and told himself that he had to make the best of it. He opened the newspaper that he still held and flipped through it. It was slow going in German, but what he could make out sounded terrible. Of course, Gregory knew about the Nazi persecution of the Jews in Germany and Austria, but vaguely knowing about something from the other side of the world and being there to see it happen were two entirely different things. Gregory was not Jewish, but Wolf was, he knew. It was not something that they ever spoke about, but now Gregory wondered if the combination of being a proud Austrian and having once been the member of not merely one, but two persecuted groups, made Wolf further suffer now to see what his homeland had come to. There were many letters to the editor, arguing in favor, and even more letters arguing against, union with Germany. Germany's military strength was no match for a small, mostly rural land like the Austria of today, this Vienna and its environs plus some alpine landscape. That was all that was left of the only recently still mighty, mountains-to-ocean, Austro-Hungarian Empire. Gregory shut the newspaper and sighed. Every time he listened to the news, he ended up regretting that he had done so. He briefly felt in himself the old itch to go and do something hopelessly noble to save the world. But then he reminded himself that he had already saved the world twice over, damn it, and surely by now it must be someone else's job. They journeyed along the northern route, going westward through the length of Austria, through Melk, Linz, and Salzburg. Wolf sat by the window and eagerly looked out. It was still a huge empire in his eyes, and nothing would ever change that, Gregory could see. Gregory tried to imagine how he would feel if the Nazis were trying to take over Louisiana, and it was an awful thought. Anastasia reclined herself on the long cushion of the train bench and rested with her eyes closed and without breathing, the kind of rest that Gregory could do for short periods, but that Anastasia could apparently do for hours at a stretch, where her chest did not rise and fall, and where she appeared entirely lifeless, something that would have greatly disturbed any visitor to their compartment. Whenever the conductor came, Gregory tried to spare him the sight of Anastasia like this, and got into the habit of anticipating him by wedging his shoe into the opening of the compartment door, so that the conductor could only briefly look in, while Gregory held the tickets out into the corridor for him. They passed into the mountainous heart of the country, now summery and beautiful, with grass greener than anything that Gregory had ever seen, and meadows dotted with picturesque little flowers that would probably all have died a sweaty death in a single sweltering afternoon in Louisiana. Gregory tried to imagine a local Austrian family sitting in a small triangular alpine chalet with flower boxes choked with red mums, and everyone eating hunks of pale cheese and dark bread. A brown and white cow with a large alpine cowbell would complete the picture nicely. Gregory tried to remember the last time he had eaten cheese, and after a few minutes, the effort of remembering put him into a light slumber. He did not know how long he had dozed when a sharper bump in the movement of the train shook him awake. He had been dreaming, he knew, and the corners of his eyes were still moist. Had anyone noticed? Embarrassed, he pulled himself to standing, opened the compartment door, and then shut it behind himself. He stood at the window in the corridor and dug furiously in his pockets for his handkerchief before anyone passed by. In his brief dream, the motion of the train had turned into D'Artagnan running beneath him, and the sun streaming through the window had turned into the small, always warm form of Vivian, sitting astride D'Artagnan's back, just in front of Gregory, and all he had to do was throw his arm across her collarbone and shoulders, and she would fall backward a bit toward his chest, just as she had done, and the back of her head would be somewhere beneath his chin, and he could close his eyes and get as emotional as he wanted to, because her back was to him, and she could not see. Gregory had heard of telepathy and had often wondered if it really worked. And now he thought, if it cannot work now, in this moment, then what is even the point of such a force? He closed his eyes, rested his hands on the small bar running beneath the window and along the corridor, and with all the effort of focus he could muster, he sent his thoughts across the spinning earth to wherever Vivian happened to be. "It is not my fault," he told her. "If I could, I would write to you and return to you right now. If I could, I would marry you and make you mine. If I could, I would be the most passionate and tender husband to you that any man could ever be. If I could, I would speak directly into your head, into your heart, and you would hear me and understand me, even beyond any mere words. If I could, I would disappear entirely into you, and my vanishing would be no great loss to this world, surely, so that we could never be parted again by any force in existence. If I could, I would tell you right now how much and in what way I love you. If I could. If, beloved." He stood there with his eyes closed and let the force of emotion sweep over him in a wave. Although the train was quite warm, somehow none of that warmth was getting in suddenly, to beneath his skin. He opened his eyes, pulled out his pocket watch from his vest to check the time, put it away again, reached up his fingers to tighten his dark tie, and then he walked to the restaurant car, where he created a small stir as he passed the table of ladies, and he ordered himself a small black coffee. Then he sat with his back to the table of talkative ladies, holding his coffee cup in his hands until all of its warmth was gone. "My hands itch to hold you, beloved," he thought, "but the best that I can make do is to hold this coffee cup and wish it was you. How pathetic." He walked back to the compartment, let himself in, and pointed out the window. "Where are we now?" he asked. "Approaching Linz," Wolf told him. "Linz is a most interesting place. Let me tell you of an adventure that once befell me in Linz." Gregory sat down and let Wolf share his story, which led to another story, which led to another one. It was an entirely different experience speaking with Wolf in his home country, rather than speaking with Wolf, the practical repairer of books, who lived in New Orleans. It made Gregory wonder, are we cardboard cutouts that get pasted onto different backdrops as we move through the world? Or are we more like glass vases, maintaining a certain shape, but otherwise letting through the details of our surroundings? To change myself, can I just move to another place? If Vivian is really through with me and does not wish to see me anymore, can I leave the pain of it behind if I move to another place? And overall, would I be a better, more interesting, and happier person elsewhere? Should I drift around the world for a while just to find out? He asked Wolf then what he liked best about traveling, and they spoke about that for a while. "Ah, Karl would have loved this," said Wolf after a time of quiet, still looking out of the window at the glorious Austrian summer. Gregory nodded, and then they were both silent after that, until they arrived in Salzburg. The porters came to carry their bags off of the train, since they were to overnight at the Hotel Sacher in Salzburg. Salzburg was not exactly a booming metropolis, but it was a large enough place to have people come out and gather at night. So Gregory, Wolf, and Anastasia parted ways, with the agreement to meet up in Wolf's room in the early hours of the morning, after midnight. Gregory relished being alone for a bit, and ran around in the warm night with all the enthusiasm of a tiger let loose after recently being transported in a small cage. To be good at something, even if it was not at all what Gregory wished he was good at, was still something, and there was delight in it. Pleasure, even. As long as he forgot to remind himself that he was actually feeling miserable. Afterwards, he at last found a bar that served good apricot brandy, and the evening took on a kind of soft sparkle. Is this a slight bit of hope that I'm feeling? He wondered. Don't be ridiculous. It's just drunkenness, the ever gloomier of the two voices inside him said. He thought about drinking himself under the table, but then remembered that he had a business meeting with Wolf and Anastasia in a few more hours, and that they would be giving him instructions which he was expected to remember later. Wolf's sumptuously furnished hotel suite was dark. The curtains were drawn, and there were lit candles everywhere when Gregory walked in, wobbling only slightly. Is this to be a meeting or a séance? Asked Gregory. Just come in and shut the door already, complained Wolf. Or do you insist that we draw even further attention to ourselves and the fact that we are still awake? Or to the fact that there are 3 of us in here, whereas the more typical past-midnight rendezvous involve only 2? Laughed Anastasia from somewhere in the shadows. So she was here. This meant that his prayers had not been answered, and the devil had not carried her off. How unfortunate. How is it that you are already here? Asked Gregory. I came early. I came earlier, she said matter-of-factly in her sharp Russian accent, and she leaned forward into the candlelight. Always beautiful beyond all description, she was now almost impossible to look at. The same glow that overtook Gregory in his evening excursions was now stamped all across Anastasia's features. Gregory's mouth fell open. This was how she had managed to come so early. Whereas it had always been the custom for Gregory, Wolf, and Karl to wait an hour or so before appearing in each other's company again, Anastasia felt no such compunction to hide the shimmer radiating from her every pore. There was no magnificence left in the world, Gregory thought. She had selfishly absorbed it all into her being. Her dress had straps so thin that her shoulders were almost entirely bare, and her skin gleamed with a moon-like shine that made him suddenly want to caress her shoulders with his bare lips. Her hair was like gleaming black onyx. It was impossible to look at her and not desire her, not to feel worshipful and awed by her goddess-like presence. Her violet eyes, always unusual and beautiful, were now mesmerizing. Between the apricot brandy and looking at her, Gregory thought for a moment that he would topple over at her feet. 2 more drinks, and she probably could have had him, any way that she wanted him, and whatever she wanted him for. He was completely stupefied at the sight of her now, and she knew it. He could see, because her eyes sparkled mischievously, and her mouth curled up at the corners in a taunting smile. He knew for certain that the inside of her mouth must still be extremely warm, and that almost made him break into another rare sweat. How, after all I have lived through, and after my earlier experience with the other goddess predator, am I still so ridiculously easy to reel in? He thought with self-disgust. She had done it on purpose, he realized, and anger and desire collided in him with abrupt fierceness. I did not come for this, Gregory growled at her, Get out of here until you are ready to discuss business." Wolf stepped closer, took a look at Anastasia, and shuddered. "This is entirely unseemly, Anastasia. Gregor is right. Leave and come back in an hour. You should be ashamed." Anastasia's smirk disappeared as her delicate eyebrows came closer together. "Make him leave too, then, until he sobers up. How is being drunk any better?" Wolf turned his back, paced the edge of the parlor, and wrung his hands. "Ach, Gott! Why did I have to be saddled with the two of you? Anastasia, out!" He pointed at the door, and she reluctantly stood up and walked toward it. As she passed Gregory, she whispered to him, "Admit it. You will never forget what I looked like tonight." "Yes, nor how you acted," thought Gregory, but he said nothing, and made sure not to inhale again until the door was closed, and the sweet movement of air that she had swept through the room with her had subsided. Gregory sat down on the sofa, among all the candles, and Wolf sat down on the armchair nearby. "I'm sorry. She is basically a nice person, but she can be terrible," said Wolf lamely. "Sometimes I think that if you only expressed some interest in her, she would leave you alone." "Do you have any other suggestions?" said Gregory in a morose tone. "Wear a garland of garlic cloves, perhaps?" suggested Wolf. "Would that pass for customary in these parts?" asked Gregory. "Perhaps if I paired it with an alpine hat?" Wolf looked at Gregory in the candlelight and sighed. "You could never pass for customary in any part of the world, I'm sorry to say. You want to blame Anastasia for her beauty, but you are every bit as beautiful yourself, and even on a regular day. How the world can even hold two creatures such as you and her is beyond my understanding, and how you can look as healthy and whole as you do, but be so broken inside, is also an enduring mystery to me. Creatures of both genders fall in love with you and begin to lust for what they cannot have. You absorb all of their bitter looks and wonder if you should fault yourself for it. I often think I do not envy either of you. And you always take everything even further, to the extreme, until you are even fighting against the natural order of things. You go out at night and run after others, and then, once it starts to get easy, and they come to offer themselves to you, you run from them." Gregory shivered. "Only you could consider creatures such as us to be part of the natural order of things. Yes, I hate it when people start to notice me and to pathetically strike up conversation and move in closer. It has always struck me as unfair and unsportsmanlike to take them then, and I'm very uncomfortable with it." "And as a result, you spend more time running than anyone else I have ever known," sighed Wolf. "If there is an easier and a harder way to do something, for a certainty you would pick the hardest way possible each time." There was nothing to reply to this, so they sat together, in sparse conversation, and more often in silence, until Anastasia returned. Still pouting, and still stunningly beautiful, but at least now dressed in a blouse and skirt rather than evening wear. And then the meeting began. "Now for the plan. You and Anastasia will pretend to be husband and wife," began Wolf. Gregory rolled his eyes. "Surely you jest. You mean to tell me that I traveled all this way and then waited another hour to hear an idea this daft?" "We discussed this months ago in my apartment, Gregor. Were you not paying attention then? Now let me finish," said Wolf. "Your father has just died, and you are helping to transport his body to Vaduz, where the family tomb is." "Where is the body?" asked Gregory. "In the coffin in the back of the hearse," replied Wolf. Who is in it? Someone Anastasia has actually killed?" inquired Gregory casually. This elicited a hiss from Anastasia. "No, but it is a box large enough to hold a lot of books," said Wolf harshly, clearly growing impatient with having to explain his plan again in the minutest of detail to idiots. "Again, we went over all this back in my apartment in New Orleans. Don't you recall?" "Vaguely," said Gregory. To be honest, He only recalled having ogled at length Anastasia's gorgeous physique that evening, but had no idea of what anyone had said. "Do remind me again, who will you be, Wolf? Santa Claus?" "Gregor, now, why do you feel the need to inject the rudeness? Should I throw you out next?" cried Wolf. "If we have to wait another hour for him, it will be dawn before we start our meeting," complained Anastasia. "I will be your uncle, brother of the deceased. I carry the Liechtenstein passports and have made all of the arrangements back in Vaduz," said Wolf. "Do you really have a Liechtenstein passport?" asked Gregory, with a flicker of real interest. "What do you think? That I spent all that time making preparations back home and have nothing to show for it? Of course I have a Liechtenstein passport. I also have a death certificate and a grave plot in Vaduz, for which I also have the paperwork. And I have a priest on alert who has been told that my brother is very much ailing, who has assured me that he is at the ready to say Mass over what will be by then, unbeknownst to him, an empty box," said Wolf. "Did it feel doubly deceitful lying to a man of the cloth?" asked Gregory. "Why should I feel bad? As a priest he must be used to it. The entire church-going rigmarole is already a sham. How is praying over an empty box and telling people there's a body inside it that much different than praying over a wafer and telling people that God is inside it?" shrugged Wolf. "You are truly remarkable in your religious views," said Gregory, shaking his head. "I will take that as a compliment," sniffed Wolf. "But you will therefore have to enter the church to participate in the funeral mass?" asked Gregory. Wolf pointed at the side of his head. "Damage to the ear during the Great War, and cannot stand to be in a confined space with an organ playing. Now, stop asking about irrelevant details and focus. Here is what will happen and what you will need to do. You have all of the key speaking parts because Anastasia's Russian accent would only raise questions. If asked, say she is Bulgarian but very shy. Anastasia, do your best to look shy, assuming such a thing is doable for you." They went over the details and reviewed the paperwork before ending the meeting. A private meeting would be more difficult in Innsbruck because Bedřich would be there, together with additional team members. Gregory wondered what false reason Anastasia had given her colleagues for them to provide their assistance. Whatever she had said, he was certain that the phrase, "smuggled antique books," did not appear in it. He wanted to ask her, but then realized he did not really care. The next day they finished their journey relatively quickly and arrived at the train station in Innsbruck. They took a car to the Grand Hotel Europa, where Bedřich waited to tell them that all was ready. Gregory was on pins and needles when they checked in with the clerk, as Wolf asked if there were any messages. There were. Ferdinand had postponed his physical arrival to New Orleans, and therefore the further investigation of Vivian Prevet's address was also postponed. Well, Wolf might think that Ferdinand was no longer useless, but he sure seemed useless to Gregory. Gregory worked to remember not to grind his teeth together in sheer frustration. The day was sunny and beautiful again, and all went swimmingly until the following day, when Wolf went to meet with the outgoing rector of the Faculty of Literature and History at the University of Innsbruck. There was an issue with the rector's planned replacement, because now it had come to light that the Nazi Party had raised complaints about the proposed replacement's suitability for the role, and so the search was on for another candidate. The current rector did not think it a good idea suddenly to return Wolf his books, suggested that they should all wait for the new rector to be named, and maybe they should wait until more peaceful times also. In other words, it was apparent that the rector had had a change of heart since his earlier correspondence with Wolf. The team settled in for a longer stay in Innsbruck than they had originally anticipated. Gregory's acute despair began to flare up again, and he bought himself a new pocket notebook with a calendar in it so he could count the days since he had seen Vivian last and could conjecture when he might see her next. In the end, after a couple of weeks had passed in which Gregory had seen all of the local sites 6 times over, the rector agreed to stop waiting for his replacement and to let Wolf have the books back after all. Everything was quickly done, and Herr Gregor Berger and his wife Frau Berger and Herr Berger Senior climbed into a hearse and headed toward the Liechtenstein border. Frau Berger had no chance at convincingly playing a shy woman, but one had to give it to her. She did sob rather well on cue. Gregory did think that the extent of her grief seemed to surpass anything that a woman had ever felt toward a father-in-law, but somehow they got through without anyone asking to have anything opened. Beyond the border, the coffin was opened and the books removed and replaced with plausibly heavy dirt before the coffin made its predetermined trip into town, and then to the church, and finally to the cemetery. It was all wrapped up in a matter of days, and was quite anticlimactic. Then they said goodbye to Bedřich, and the final stretch from Liechtenstein to Switzerland was then made by Wolf, Gregory, and Anastasia alone. They disguised themselves as hikers, although it made Wolf more than a bit light-headed to watch Gregory stuff extremely old and precious bound books into his hiker's backpack as if they were campers' rations. They got on the train in Sargans and headed east again, this time across Switzerland, until they reached Bern. In Bern they stayed at the Bellevue Palace Hotel. In the pattern well established by now, Gregory waited impatiently with Wolf down by the front desk for word from Louisiana, and the word was that Ferdinand had sent a telegram that he had still not made it to New Orleans. Gregory took in this latest news and then went upstairs and dressed to the nines to go out. He remembered walking down the broad, elegant, sweeping staircase of the Bellevue Palace Hotel and toward the front doors, but then everything got lost in a haze of heartache and drink. While Wolf ran around during the days and visited with his bankers, signing forms and delivering his various treasures up to a diversified array of safety deposit boxes, Gregory found himself sinking into an alcohol-induced stupor similar to his days aboard ship. He would wake to a knock on the door from Anastasia, would see her nose wrinkle up and her face scowl as she took in the sight of the wreck that was him these days, and then he would tell her to go away so that he could go back to bed. He may have been lying in the most luxurious bed in Bern, but he felt like he was alone in a cold gutter, with snow falling on him, and gradually accumulating until all trace of him was invisible to the passing world. The visit to the many banks raised various other financial matters that Wolf had to attend to, and Gregory would have complained about the additional delay that this caused, but of course Wolf also helped to manage Gregory's financial affairs, so even sozzled as he was, Gregory was wise enough to keep his mouth shut and to just be grateful. The bankers spoke in worried, low tones to Wolf about their fears of war and how this would mean an influx of banking customers for the Swiss, but also how such an influx might cause changes in the scrutiny of banking customers. And although Wolf and Gregory had not come by their fortunes by underhanded means, Gregory knew that there were certain aspects of their financial affairs that would not stand up well to close scrutiny. The delay in Bern ended up being 3 weeks in total, so long that Ferdinand actually made it to New Orleans before they left Bern. During one of Gregory's now more rare, fully sober moments, he was visiting Wolf in his suite when Wolf was called down to the front desk to take an overseas call that was on the line for him. It had just been patched through by what must have been an ungodly number of carefully coordinating operators. Gregory wanted to run down with him, but just managed to remain in the armchair he was sitting in by grabbing onto the armrests and waiting until the feeling passed. When Wolf returned, however, Gregory shot out of the chair. "What is the news? What is the news?" he asked Wolf impatiently. "Ferdinand is at the store. He said he took off the 'closed for vacation' sign and replaced it with a 'the owner is ill' sign, to which I objected, since I am clearly physically healthy, but he told me that I was overlooking the fact that I was ill in the head to travel to Europe at this turbulent time. I told him that we have had no trouble, and that things are not as lively as you would imagine from reading the papers. But you asked about the news. The news, and it is distressing, is that the telephone company is about to disconnect our brand new telephone line in the store due to unpaid bills. Apparently, there are monthly fees even when there is no use of the line. Can you believe that? A swift beheading. That is what these modern company managers deserve. That is how we would have dealt with such pranks in my day. At any rate, Ferdinand is at the store now, and is going through the most urgent of the mail, and will submit any immediately due bill payments for us. I think I may have underestimated how complex it is to leave one's business for longer than a few weeks anymore, in this modern age. One's actual customers are the least of the headache. Wolf looked at Gregory, who had come to within a few inches of his face in his impatience. Oh, but of course the update on our utilities is not what you were waiting for. Ferdinand has looked, but has found no sign of the Prevets. They have no vehicle license. They have no telephone line. They do not even appear to be registered voters. Congratulations, Gregor. You have somehow managed to make friends with persons as obscure to trace as we are. Gregory felt the expectation in him rush out in a single breath, and he turned around, ran his fingers through his hair, and dropped dejectedly back into his armchair. I'm sorry, Gregor. I asked you to come and help me, and you said it would be no problem, but it has turned out to be a great sacrifice for you. And it turns out that I troubled you and Anastasia needlessly, because all of the things that I had been worried about did not come to pass. Please forgive me for having asked you to come on this voyage, said Wolf sadly. It probably makes no difference. As you said, there really was no chance anyways that my love with Vivian would work, replied Gregory morosely. It was always like trying to build something meaningful out of the splinters of futility. You are right that I did not advise this friendship, said Wolf. But now your heart is in it, and I think hers is also. So you need to stop thinking about what is advisable and start thinking about where you both could compromise to make it work. Wolf came around to sit on the sofa across from Gregory. I know. Compromise comes about as easily to you as it might be for me to have to set half of my best books on fire. But compromise is what you will have to do now, to pacify your heart. I can see you suffering greatly over all of this. I know you have hardly been sober these recent weeks. You have that gnawed-upon look returning to your features that you had when I first met you. And I know something of where your depths of misery might go. You believed she loved you too. Then compromise now. She wants a man to marry and to love her. You can be that man. For a while, said Gregory. Yes, for a while, but in this world, everything is just for a while. It is hardly a betrayal. You can give her a beautiful home, lovely dresses. Wolf, Gregory interrupted him. She wants a man, not a couturier. She wants me to deliver all the solidity and passion and delights that an ardent young man delivers to his mistress between the hours of sunset and sunrise, not the kind of affection and resources that an older man or father might provide, said Gregory, suffering to have to say it out loud. And you want to give those passionate delights to her also, I know, said Wolf. More than anything, admitted Gregory suddenly, in a voice that came out as a whisper. But you cannot, Wolf finished for him. I understand, and I am suggesting compromise. Now what exactly is it that you think you cannot give her between the hours of sunset and sunrise, as you so poetically put it? Wolf gave him a piercing gaze, and Gregory instinctively shaded his eyes with his hand. I cannot have this conversation with you, Wolf. Do not misunderstand. It is not because I know of your own preferences. It is because I cannot have this conversation with anyone. The last words were spoken in almost a whisper. Gregor, listen to me. I gave this advice to you before, when I found you metaphorically setting yourself on fire over her that night in your living room when she was sleeping in your arms. If possible, crawl out of the hole in your heart where you have pulled yourself into and give what is still possible to give. Do you have arms to hold her with, hands to touch her with, lips to kiss her with? Then start there. Let her be the one to tell you that it is not enough. Go down fighting for heaven's sake, or would you rather fail her for certain, for lack of trying? I know she is only 17, but if you do love her like this, and she loves you, then kiss her and give her a reason to believe that she will have you one day, instead of telling her that you can never wed. What foolishness that was! Time moves swiftly and changes all things with it. She seemed content enough to sleep in your arms not so very long ago. Might some of your affections not please her still? How did it all break apart, I now wonder, so that it led to your declaration to her that you could never wed? She broke into my apartment one night and saw me after a chase. I was like a lamp on high wattage still when I opened the door and walked in on her, said Gregory dully, remembering with sudden shame how he had then chased Vivian down the street that evening, and how deeply pleasurable that had been for him, despite the knowledge that he was frightening her and hurting her. Even now he nearly choked with remorse and guilt, and the painful longing for her. "Ach Gott," said Wolf with a low sigh. "I am on the inside of that magic, and yet the sight of you in that afterglow is enough to make me want to give myself to you." She had no chance. "I'm so sorry, Gregor. There is no way back to the moment just before she saw you like that. That moment ended her innocence." Gregory made a face. Now who was talking poetically, he pointed out. Wolf wiped at his brow. "Ach, how do you get yourself into these messes, Gregor? Your whole existence is the journey of a person on fire and perpetually looking for a snowbank to dive into so that he can save himself. There is no way to talk about your problems without talking poetically. They are of poetic proportions. Look, I can see that I have not swayed you. But do spend some time and think on it. Compromise may not come naturally, but it does show maturity of heart. When you have gone as far as you can down the path of urgency and intensity of love, perhaps you might ponder developing its purity and its depth instead. You can love her better, even if you cannot set yourself more on fire emotionally over her than you already are. Think on it. But how would we live together? What would we do every breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Asked Gregory with despair. Others have done it. You two would not be the first. And who said the compromising would only be on your side? Compromise by definition means both sides have to give. You give where you can, from sunset to sunrise, for example, and she gives where she can, letting you do what you need to do to live, giving you your space for your secrets, protecting you from the world's prejudices, from sunrise to sunset. I have never been married myself, of course, but I hear that in the end, all marriages are something like this, even the more usual ones. Think on it. Gregory tried instead to valiantly forget for the next several days, but there was no amount of Scottish whiskey that could put the conversation with Wolf comfortably out of mind. His conscience tore at him. Hadn't he showed up at the hospital with that first bouquet, knowing that he might create unfillable expectations in this young girl whom he had already injured enough? Writing to her mother, getting to know them both, tenderly and daily investing in this friendship, only to turn his back on Vivian in the end when the going got uncomfortable for him. Wasn't this what a cad might do? Enjoying what he wished to enjoy of a friendship with a beautiful woman, only to turn his back on her when she began pushing for the promise of honorable marriage. If he did as Wolf suggested, was that somehow inauthentic and beneath him? Or could his pride suffer his shortcomings as a man to become fully known to his beloved? Or if he did not do as Wolf suggested, was that now the sin? Vainly trying to keep his pride intact at the price of everyone's happiness. And what if he returned ready to compromise, but she was not? She was young and perfect and still innocent, regardless of what Wolf thought, and she could have anyone she wanted and any kind of life that she desired. Why would she want him? She did not have to want this kind of a marriage, may not have loved him enough to want to spend a lifetime protecting him and his oddities. Well, her lifetime, at least. He sighed. Every thought just seemed to lead to another one that raced him on in the same sad mental circle. They left Bern and took the train through Zurich to Munich, where the sight of a sea of red Nazi flags made Wolf shiver with revulsion. In Munich they stayed at the glittering, if heavily Nazi-infested, Bayerischer Hof Hotel, awaiting Dieter's return from a trip out of town. But Gregory no longer noticed much of what was going on around him, and no longer waited eagerly for any word of Vivian. They had now been in Europe more than 3 weeks longer than their initial itinerary had planned for, almost a month off schedule, and he had not been able to get a single communication out to Vivian, excluding fervent daily prayer and writing in his journal. Was she still waiting for him to come back and patch things up, he wondered. Had she ever been? She had looked to be fairly thoroughly done with him back in June. Perhaps she had forgotten all about him. Perhaps she had never truly cared. Perhaps she had only ever loved his 800 acres. Suddenly also homesick, he realized that he missed his apartment and his horses and the Mullins. What he wouldn't give to have D'Artagnan beneath him and to be running through familiar country again. That night he had a rented car take him into the heart of Munich, where he went into his drinking, like a man returning from war might tear through a brothel. Every ache, every empty corner of his heart was going to get filled with emotion-numbing liquor, or he would end his existence trying, he thought, gritting his teeth. When the bar that he was in closed, he went to another bar, a seedier one, and the evening went on and on. At some point in the night, he found himself sitting with his head hanging between his hands, his elbows on the bar, and he was surprised to discover that he was crying. Gregory Morgan never cried in public, in part out of honor, and in part out of horror that somehow his father might return from the grave and see him crying. But the other patrons at the bar ignored him. No one said anything, and the night went on. Then eventually it got too hot and too filled with other humans breathing, his ears too full of their loud heartbeats and loud laughter, and every sound of it hurt. The alcoholic fog that he had filled himself with started to destabilize and to shift inside of him, and all of the hurting places started to make their presence known all at once. He had to get out. He clawed an uncertain amount of cash out of his wallet, left it on the bar, and staggered toward the door. Outside, the night was surprisingly cool, and the breeze blowing through it was of autumn. He was suddenly unsure of where he was, in which season, in which city, or how he had gotten here. Perhaps this was New Orleans at Mardi Gras, and he and Wolf had just passed Vivian on the street a short while before, and he had reached out and grasped her, and pressed her against him like he would if he were still the completely healthy and whole young man that he had once been, desiring her so much in that moment that he briefly forgot that he was not like her anymore, that his youth had already ended long ago. He stood still for a moment in the darkness, straining his memory, trying to feel her against him again, in this embrace that had made such an unforgettable impact on her. But then he heard the sound of a foreign language in his ears, and he knew he could not be in New Orleans. Disoriented, a roar in his ears suddenly, feeling dizzy and more than slightly sick, he sat down on the curb, and then his stomach turned itself inside out, and he retched out its contents onto the street. Somewhere in his mind he knew this was very, very dangerous, that he should run away before anyone came by and noticed. But he could not run. He could not even move. He closed his eyes for a moment, and then the world went dark around him. The next thing he felt was that someone had picked him up as if he was a sack of grain, threw him over his shoulder, and began carrying him somewhere. It felt too good to be off of those hard stones to complain much about it, and he couldn't really move his mouth in any case. After a while, the carrying stopped. He was set down and left to slump against the side of a building, while several voices spoke quietly near him. And then he was being lifted again, this time by two people, and they carried him inside, where he lost track of the world again. When he came to his senses, he was lying on a welcome, soft surface, and someone was holding him and wiping his face with a damp cloth. It was not Wolf. It was a woman. Was it her? Vivi, he tried to say, but all he could get out was "V." "Shut up," said the low, sharp voice, and for a moment he thought it was the other woman from long ago who had at times spoken to him like this, but he was mistaken. It was Anastasia. The key point was that it was not Vivian, his mind mourned. Not Vivian, not Vivian, not Vivian. Began Gregory, but the rest of his sentence vanished in a gurgle. He wanted to open his eyes, but his eyelids were heavy as lead. Anastasia finished wiping off his face and was now pressing a cheek against his forehead, and where she touched him, her skin felt hot and alive. Although it felt heavenly, he wanted to push her away, but then he felt an unexpected splash of dampness fall on him. Was she crying? Somewhere in the background, a door closed rather loudly, and then Gregory heard Wolf's voice. "I did not realize it was like this between you two. Is all that squabbling you two always do just a part of your bedroom games, or has something changed since Innsbruck? I confess I am entirely confused. Gregor, do you want me to make her go away?" Gregory still could not make his voice obey him. All he could do was feebly lift a hand and place it on the back of Anastasia's dark hair, indicating to Wolf that he did not want Anastasia to go away. "Oh, so this is how it is. I see," said Wolf tersely. "Well, clearly you don't need anyone to save you, Gregor. I do very much hope you are not falling from one foolishness into another, but if yes, go figure out your own problems this time." And with that, Gregory heard the door open and close again rather abruptly as Wolf left the room. Gregory sighed, and Anastasia continued to hold him, and he could not tell if they were both crying or if it was only her. "I found you in the gutter, Gregor. For God's sake, for a moment I thought you were a corpse. It is a good thing that I am stronger than I look, because I was able to pick you up and carry you back to the hotel. But carrying you senseless through the lobby, even at this hour, would have been difficult to explain. Gregor, is this really all about that small bunny? That young girl that I saw you with back in New Orleans?" Anastasia's voice was so close to his ear that although her voice was hardly above a whisper, he could hear it as if it were speaking directly inside his skull. Gregory hesitated, and then nodded, too weary suddenly to deny it. "Wolf told me something of this, but I did not want to believe it. How can you be so in love with something so fragile and temporary? Something that will never fully understand you, or understand what you need, or love you back like you want to be loved? What is the appeal?" Gregory shrugged, then started coughing. His throat felt as if he had been drinking nothing but sawdust for days. Anastasia let go of him, which made him moan with sudden renewed heartache and disappointment. "Do wait just a minute. I will find you a glass of water," said Anastasia. Her tone was the closest to tender that Gregory had ever heard it to be. He heard the water running, and then she returned, let him prop up on one elbow, and she put the glass to his lips. He drank it in one draught. Then Anastasia took the glass from him, pushed her palm against his chest, and then he fell back onto the sofa he was on. It appeared to be covered with a sheet, probably to keep the gutter dirt off of it. His eyes finally opened, and he saw her sitting down on the ground next to him, her violet eyes looking at him with a concerned expression, and one of her arms encircling his head and moving over his hair in the maternal sort of way, while the other sought his hand. It was the best thing he had felt in months, he had to admit to himself. He had the briefest thought that perhaps an infinitely long future with Anastasia would not be so terrible after all. "So you just met her one day, a few months ago, and that was that? Your heart was hers?" Anastasia asked him. "No," croaked Gregory, "since she was a child." Anastasia's eyes grew wide. "You have known her for so long, and you have been watching her grow up all these years?" "Not exactly," croaked Gregory. And thank God for that, he thought. Wolf was right. She probably would have grown up sitting in his lap, him with his hands in her hair and his lips against her ear, whispering stories to her, a kind of world hardly appropriate for a young girl once she began to bloom into womanhood, the purity of his intentions notwithstanding. "But you really do love her," said Anastasia slowly, as if coming to this realization for the first time, that Vivian could really be something more than a game of hunter and hunted to someone like Gregory. "Yes," whispered Gregory, closing his eyes again and focusing on Anastasia's hand against his hair. "What did you do to make it happen? What starts something like that, I wonder?" asked Anastasia. "I just looked at her," replied Gregory truthfully. And the memory of Vivian as the small barefoot child who collided with his shins made his heart squeeze with an ache in his chest. "And what will you do when she goes?" asked Anastasia. Gregory shook his head. "Try not to think about that." "I caused you a lot of trouble then when I visited you in New Orleans," said Anastasia, connecting additional points. What was this new emotion in her voice? Was it possibly remorse? "Yes," said Gregory. "There was trouble. She was very jealous and upset." Anastasia was silent for a long while. Then she said, "I am sorry, Gregor. I did not mean to hurt her. Or you," she added. Then she turned her face away. "Even on this voyage, I have been rather beastly to you." Gregory closed his eyes again and felt Anastasia bring her head down by his shoulder. Then after a while he heard a strange, small sound, and he opened his eyes, turned his head, and there was Anastasia sobbing onto the cushions beside his head. Was she pretend crying again, he wondered, but only for a moment. This was real. He had spent so much time equating her in his mind with the other one, the dangerous one who had left him without any remorse once, that he had perhaps unfairly tarred Anastasia with the same brush. Now here was Anastasia being completely different than that. They were not the same woman at all. "I'm so sorry I misjudged you," he thought. He reached a hand over to Anastasia's shoulder. "Hey," he said hoarsely, "you're crying. Why?" "I forgive you." Anastasia shook her head, her face buried in the sofa. Because I have never loved anyone like that," she cried. "Maybe never loved anyone ever." Then after a few moments, she seemed to recompose herself a bit, and she said simply, "I envy you." Gregory sighed and said sarcastically, "Yes, and just look at all this happiness that this love has brought me. I'm so happy that you are having to pick me out of gutters. Yes, who would not want this wonderful thing?" He sniffed, and then he looked more closely at his suit sleeve. "I think I threw up on myself." Anastasia lifted her head, and her violet eyes, now bloodshot with tears, were the most nearly human feature that Gregory had ever seen on her. "You did throw up on yourself, and maybe someone else did too. I can only bear to sit here because I'm not breathing, so as not to let any smells in through my nose. But you know something? You are still so handsome that it hurts." She looked at his mouth. "May I kiss you?" she asked, her voice small and full of vulnerability, sounding nothing like the Anastasia that he had ever known before this conversation, and nothing at all like the other one she made him remember. That other one did not matter anymore, he reminded himself suddenly. She was nothing now. Vivian was everything. He thought he would be afraid, but suddenly all fear of her seemed to melt, and he was far beyond it, in a more serene place. "Go ahead. Kiss me if you want," he said, thinking now only of Vivian. "But I belong to her." Anastasia pulled herself up on her knees and put both of her hands on the sides of his head. She gave him a long look, full of so many emotions that he could not tell what she was thinking. Then she quietly said, "I know you do. I can see it in your eyes. If you ever need anything from me, tell me, and I will help you in any way that I can." Then she wiped a last tear, bent her glorious, goddess-like head over him, and chastely touched his lips with hers. It only lasted a second, and then she stood up and brushed off her gown, which clung to her shoulders and her hips in a way that Gregory could have looked at all day without tiring of the scenery. She had picked him up and carried him home on those shoulders, he suddenly realized gratefully. Like him, Anastasia was in truth very little like what she looked like. There was kindness in her, more than he would have ever suspected, and more than there had ever been in the other woman that he so often found himself comparing her with. "Gregor, you are a mess," she said, her voice returning to its familiar groove, but her face wore a gentle smile. "I know," he agreed, smiling back at her. "Go take at least 5 baths in a row before I see you again, and burn this suit. It is covered in blood and vomit, and possibly also piss. I cannot believe I just kissed you like that." "I cannot believe it either," he said, and then they both laughed. He looked up at her, standing above him like a divine being, a shimmering statue of beauty, while he lay there in his own filth. Suddenly he wanted nothing more than to urgently go and clean himself up. "Go, Anastasia," he said hoarsely. "I will be all right. You are incredibly beautiful, as you know. If you can help it, please try not to kiss me again." "Fine," she agreed. "If I can help it." Then she gave him a half-hearted smirk and left, but he instinctively knew that she would not cross his unspoken boundary again. "You have made some kind of a peace with Anastasia," commented Wolf a few days later. "And I notice that you are much more sober as well. Is there some consolation there, after all, that is, how shall I say, helping you?" "No," Gregory told him. "It still hurts just as much, but now I realize that I bear a burden that others envy me. An odd kind of realization, isn't it?" "Ah, you and your women. Gregor, I'm sorry, but I honestly have no idea what you are talking about," replied Wolf, shaking his head. At last, Dieter returned from his out-of-town travels, and all of them made the visit to his turn-of-the-century townhome outside of the city center, with a small and elegant garden planted all around it and surrounded by a thin and elegant dark metal fence. His eyes lit up like sparks as Wolf walked in, and it was visible to all that the two old friends were thrilled to see each other once more. Dieter welcomed Gregory and Anastasia, smiled at them both, gave them a tour of his place from the attic down to the cellar, and then they all went in to sit in his large, dark-paneled library, where Gregory noticed that Dieter had a large collection of medical and scientific texts on hand. Dieter insisted that Wolf take the position of honor in Dieter's largest and most comfortable-looking leather armchair, and then everyone talked together with great enthusiasm and warmth, with the exception of Gregory, who still felt like a fried egg. Dieter looked at Wolf with awe, Gregory noticed, the way a fan might look at an admired celebrity, and the usually level-headed Wolf relished the attention. Gregory was glad that Wolf was so happy. There were more visits to Dieter's place after that than any of them would have predicted, because there were additional multi-week delays in Munich. Dieter's contact for the travel supplies that Wolf needed to urgently procure for them had been recently jailed by the Nazis, and so a new arrangement needed to be put into motion. As a result, Anastasia, Gregory, and Wolf spent many evenings in the theater, and many evenings with Dieter, Dieter was a man of shorter stature, with an appearance of indeterminate but perhaps early middle age, with curly hair that was graying at the temples, and with a handsome, easy smile that made him very easy to like. Many of their first visits were focused on catching up on the whereabouts of Wolf and Dieter's various friends and acquaintances, and as they had both been at it for a long time now in this world, they knew many people. Dieter had a billiard table, and they all started their evenings playing billiards, much the same way as they would have started the evening playing tarot back in Wolf's sparkling apartment in New Orleans. "I was inspired by you," admitted Dieter, faintly blushing. "I think you are right, Wolfgang. A social gathering does call for some kind of communal activity." Aside from his friendliness, Dieter was a warrior, which came across clearly when they all sat down in his formal parlor after the games of billiards, and their discussion turned to politics. "Sometimes I fear we are all doomed," admitted Dieter. "I look at the world and the direction that it is going, and I think I do not want to see where it will all end. I always thought the Kaiser was a first-rate idiot, and now look at what we have. A cut-rate cartoonist from Austria who thinks he is an intellectual heavyweight just because he wrote a book of blatant idiocies." "Please don't remind me that he is from Austria," winced Wolf. "It cannot be helped, Wolfgang. He was born there, and then you Austrians somehow inflicted him on us here," retorted Dieter. "But soon Austria and Germany will not matter," said Wolf. "He wants it all. It would be the least surprising and most horrible development, to my way of thinking, if Austria were to be absorbed into Germany. We must fight this." Dieter sighed. "Wolfgang, there are so many things to fight. Why begin and end there? What Hitler has been doing here in Germany since he got to the top of the political pile is beyond anything I ever would have believed was possible. Things are in a dreadful state, and let us not forget the troubles beyond our borders, with the war in Spain and the communists in Russia. There will be war here as well, do not doubt it. It is just a matter of time." "Come back with us to America, then. I can help to have all of your papers arranged," Wolf told his friend. For a moment Dieter hesitated, and as he looked at Wolf, he blushed slightly, and it was as if a faraway look came into his eyes, as if he was really considering the idea. But then he shook himself and said, "And what? Leave my laboratory and all my technicians and scientific assistants, now when I feel we are coming so close? Tuberculosis will be entirely cured in the next 25 years, I am certain of it. We cannot stop our work now." "Move your laboratory to America, to one of the major cities up north where you can readily find skilled technicians and researchers to work with you," insisted Wolf. But this time Dieter just sadly shook his head. "If we all leave, we who could have done something to help, then who will be left? Just the vulnerable sheep, left defenseless for the slaughter. I am a German, and proud of it, as proud as you are to be an Austrian, and I feel that I need to be here and to help with whatever I can," said Dieter grimly. "That may end up being a hard choice to stand by," Gregory told him. "Yes, Dieter, listen to Gregor. He knows what he is talking about. He has done such service for Uncle Sam twice now. Where did that patriotism land you last, Gregor? Tell him," said Wolf. "In a trench in France, standing ankle-deep in human excrement and trying hard to avoid inhaling mustard gas," said Gregory breezily. "Ha! I am not fooled by your cynicism," Dieter told Gregory. "I can see that your actions were motivated by a strong belief that you were helping your country. Your going there was a noble gesture. Yes, I can see the heroism in your actions, so do not think you can fool me with your bluster now." Dieter smiled at Gregory, and Gregory, working intently now at pushing even the vaguest memory of excrement-filled trenches to the back of his mind, smiled back. In the end, and after a few false starts, Wolf and Dieter were at last able to find a new path by which to procure Wolf and Gregory's supplies. They would be sailing from France again, with a final sailing date now arranged with the ship's booking office for early October. Anastasia had to return to Russia, and Dita did not see the merit in traveling out to France with them, so they had one last evening at Dita's beautiful town home, and then they all parted ways. Dita was visibly stricken that Wolf was going away once more. It must be wonderful to have such a good friendship, thought Gregory with a sigh, and with someone who could really understand everything, leaving behind all need to hold back unspeakable secrets. It was also time to say goodbye to Anastasia. Gregor, perhaps you would not say that we are now friends or anything like that, but... began Anastasia. Gregory cut her off. We are friends, he said, and he gave her outstretched fingers a polite kiss. You are welcome in New Orleans at any time, and I hope we see each other again. She smiled at him, and they warmly embraced. Then they all thanked Dieter for his hospitality and his friendship, and Wolf made the final preparations for his and Gregory's voyage back home. Dieter extracted promises from Wolf to return soon, and not to let it be so long next time before visiting again. The travel itself turned out to be uneventful but long. Or maybe it only seemed longer, since Gregory was not drunk as a lord the entire voyage back across the Atlantic. Things had turned out all right, in spite of everything. They had saved Wolf's books. Gregory had not murdered Anastasia. Gregory had also not died in a gutter anywhere. From all angles, then, it had been a successful trip. The miles between him and Vivian were shortening now once more, mile by mile, reversing the widening gulf that his departure had put between them, at least geographically speaking. Gregory spent much of the sailing time writing in his journal and trying to strengthen within himself the growing resolve to forgive Vivian and to try again. Wolf was right. Compromise must be possible, and Gregory would find that middle path or die trying. Why would he have ever considered giving up without a fight, after all? This feeling of near optimism grew in strength with each mile as they approached the port of New Orleans, and it lasted him all the way through the unloading of luggage, and then the last leg of the journey back to his dusty-smelling apartment, where the cleaning lady had apparently not cracked a window open since he had been there last, although it seemed as if she had hit his bar supplies. There, in his study, was his pocket notebook, full of little notes for Vivian, and next to it was the scrap of paper with her address copied out on it. Do you have any idea how much trouble you have caused, you single scrap of paper? He thought. In his bedroom, he tripped over the stupid bow and arrow set that he had purchased on a whim and had never used, and he wondered if he should finally take it out to Thibodeau with him, as had been his plan. Then Thibodeau made him think of the Mullins and of riding, and from there, Gregory had the brief thought that everything might somehow end up all right after all. He was busy with unpacking, and then with a much-needed night on the town, and it was not until the next day, when Gregory went down to the store in the morning, that his newfound optimism took a direct hit. Wolf was standing in his small office when Gregory came in, and he poked his head out of the office doorway when he heard Gregory arrive. Ah, Gregor, there you are. You have a letter. One letter here, from a Miss Nadine Denard. Is this not Fräulein Vivian's friend, she of the tattered family Bible? Said Wolf, waving an envelope in his hand. For reasons he could not in that instant have explained, Gregory froze in his tracks. The news hit him like a glass of ice water going down the back of his collar. Why would Nadine have written to him when there was no word from Vivian? Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. With shaking fingers, Gregory took the letter, tore open the envelope, and sat down on one of the low, backless stools inside the main room of the store to read it. The words were so shocking that Gregory had to read the entire letter 3 times before putting it down again, his heart free-falling deeper into his socks with each reading. It was not a long letter. What it said was this: Dear Mr. Morgan, I have been a supporter of yours for some time now, and believe great good of you, and always saw how much you cared for my best friend, Vivian. For this reason, I want you to know that things have changed since you went away, and that Vivian has taken up with a new beau. You could say it is not my place to pass any judgment or take any sides, but I am not convinced that she has entered into this new relationship for true love. She was very hurt when you left, and I agree with her that your failure to write her anything is a grave point against you. But I cannot bring myself to truly think ill of you. You must have had some reason not to write anything. I wanted you to know how things stood, and so that you are aware that Vivian has told me she is contemplating marrying this new beau. He is older and has a job, and she feels the need to marry quickly for reasons that I do not understand. I know you always loved my friend, and I think she is making a grave mistake, and I hope you can come back, read this letter, and see if you can still put things to right. With deep respect and well wishes, Nadine Denard. Gregory finished the 3rd reading of the letter, his face now pale as a sheet, and he folded up the small paper and put it away. Wolf, he called over toward the office, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. I need to take the rest of the day off, starting immediately. You're not going to start drinking this early today, are you? Wolf asked him with suspicion, poking his head out of his office and raising his fluffy gray eyebrows. No, I urgently need to visit a jeweler, replied Gregory in a panicked voice, and he raced out of the store before Wolf could utter another word. He stopped at home for more money, changed into a finer shirt and tie, touched up his hair, rebrushed his suit jacket and vest, and then ran through the morning streets and to the jeweler's shop. The jeweler had not yet opened, so Gregory sat down to wait in the restaurant across the street. He spent the entire time wiping cold sweat from his brow with his handkerchief, not even daring to hold the hot coffee that he had ordered, lest he spill it all over himself in his agitation. He sat where he could see the jeweler's store door, and as soon as the sign on the door was flipped from closed to open, he threw some coins on the restaurant table and raced across the road. The jeweler did not have the kind of selection that Gregory thought the love of his life was truly worthy of, but Gregory did not have the luxury of time, so he pointed to the largest and most lavish-looking ring in the case, told the jeweler to forget the bow, shocked him by smacking the entire payment inclusive of tax on the counter in cash bills, and then he raced to Vivian's apartment, breathless with emotion. It was not yet 11 in the morning when he found himself standing before her door, where he had not stood in many months, belatedly realizing that he had meant to stop to buy flowers as well, but that he had entirely forgotten to do so. The door looked the same, but from Nadine's letter, that might well be all that was the same. He had noted her street name, now looked at her apartment number, and thought back on how he would have probably been willing to murder for this same information even a few weeks back. What would Vivian say? How would she receive him? Would she speak to him at all? Was she even home? What if she rejected him? What if he had come too late, as it appeared he had? Would she admit the truth to him? It would be some relief at least if she was honest with him and admitted that she had met another. But what if she lied about it? Who was this other beau, he wondered. Were they truly happy together? Had he kissed her? His heart in his mouth, sick to his stomach, and shaking like a leaf in a stiff breeze, Gregory reached out a hand and knocked on her door, ready for anything.